The term itself, Islamophobia, is so duplicitous.
Islamophobia is a scourge on our society which must be rooted out.
When you say Islamophobia, the literal meaning is an irrational fear of Islam. Why are we invoking Islam to begin with? It's an ideology that should be as open to critique as any other religion. Once you tell any particular community that we will accommodate you if you react violently, that's just simply you're giving them more motivation to continue to act more violently and demand more. It's never going to be enough.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spikes. I'm delighted to be joined down the line by Kunwar Khuldune Shahid. He is a correspondent for the Diplomat and also a Spiked contributor. Welcome, Kunwar.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.
Kunwar, you wrote recently about the grooming gang scandal in the UK. Obviously, a lot of the focus politically is around the fact that the Labour government is dropping its plans to open up local inquiries, and the lack of interest from the authorities has been one of the major sore points of that scandal. But you've also written a bit about the cultural factors that brought it around in the first place. I wonder if you could unpack some of those.
Some of the biggest grooming gang scandals in the UK, if you look at the demographics of the culprits, it has turned out that a lot of them are from the town of Mirpur, which is in Pakistan. Although they have been, in some parts have been described as South Asians and they've been described as Asians, but it's been learned that predominantly they are from Pakistan and from the British Pakistani community. Now, the culture, the culture of misogyny, sexism, unfortunately, is prevalent in Pakistan. And this is not to, for instance, not to target a particular town. The fact that they're predominantly from Mirpur is because that is the town where most of the British Pakistanis originate from. But the cultures, the good and the bad, everything overlaps with the rest of the country as well. Especially the Punjabi population of Pakistan, which is the ethnic majority in Pakistan. There are a lot of tribal customs, a lot of cultures that can be deemed and should be deemed anti-women that are prevalent in these parts of the country, and a lot of it is motivated also by misogyny that is codified in the Islamic theology as well. But of course, when you point out that it's a demographic that's so narrowed down to one particular country, unfortunately, you can't sweepingly say that it's just the whole of religion, because people, Muslims from different parts of the world are now living in Britain. But in Pakistan, unfortunately, it's a mix of all these sentiments. The idea that if you're not dressed up a certain way, you can be harassed. That originates from the Quran. The Quran asks you to cover up, asks women to cover up so as to not be harassed. Similarly, there are descriptions of women in the afterlife that you get as reward for certain acts that you do in this world as a Muslim, and similarly a lot of other things that again you could call them customs from that particular time, that particular era. But today there's a consensus globally that things like child marriages should be outlawed. There's almost a consensus. So these ideas that are ancient, these ideas that are still prevalent in many parts of the Muslim world and especially in many parts of Pakistan, these combine and they encourage men to sexually groom or assault certain women. And the demographic here also plays a part, of course, predominantly, even though there are Muslim victims of these gangs as well. And of course, in Pakistan, since the majority of the community is Muslim, the people with these ideas will target Muslims, yes. But to specifically prey on the non-Muslim girls is also a part of the radical Islamist or the jihadist worldview that divides the world into the Muslim and the non-Muslim, or the Darul Harb or the Darul Islam categories. That makes even the already vulnerable girls, and if they're non-Muslim, it makes them even more vulnerable, more prone to be abused by these men. So it's a combination of all these factors. And unfortunately, as I wrote, for the publication as well, not enough people are calling these ideas out. They're not condemning these. I think what is needed the most, of course, you can criticize the government, you can criticize the Labour Party and all of that, and that is happening. But what needs, for me personally, what I think is most needed is the critique, the backlash from within the British Pakistani, the British Muslim community, so that these few men who are still a minority, or few people who want to exercise these ideas, are still a minority, do not end up tainting, particular demographics or the entire community.
Yeah, and it's interesting to even have this conversation that we're having is getting harder and harder. The Labour government wants to restrict what it calls Islamophobia. It wants to come up with a definition of Islamophobia. Do you see potential dangers in preventing us from having these much needed discussions?
Definitely. I mean, the term itself, Islamophobia, is so duplicitous. It is. I would say it's even deceitful. I mean, when you say Islamophobia, the literal meaning is an irrational fear of Islam. Why are we invoking Islam to begin with? It's an ideology that should be as open to critique as any other religion, any other ideology. But once you insert Islam into the definition, you obviously you want to outlaw or at least make taboos out of critiques of Islam, which shouldn't be the case. You want to protect Muslims, so if you want to protect Muslims, it should be Muslim phobia or anti-Muslim bigotry is the easiest way to go about it. But to even use the term Islamophobia in this day and age, in this world where there are at least 12 Muslim majority countries that would sentence you to death for critiquing Islam. 20 others have harsh prison sentences for critiquing Islam. These are realities of this world. So the very idea that you are saying that critique or any even satire or even mockery, I would say, of a particular religion should be outlawed, and you're using that as a human rights concept when that particular religion is used in the majority of the Muslim world to persecute minorities, to persecute dissenters. It's not just duplicitous. It's dangerous, and it's an insult to the many victims of Islam in those countries. You could be, we could disagree over the interpretation. You might argue that it's a radical literalist interpretation of Islam, but the fact remains, Islam is codified in these countries. And forget about the Muslim majority countries. Islam is being used to perpetuate certain attacks, even in the West. Charlie Hebdo was attacked in France. Was not that? And what was the root of that attack? The root was that they had caricatures of Islam's prophet. So if the idea that you merit violence if you blaspheme against Islam is not limited to the Muslim majority countries. These are ideas that many across the world hold. While they might not resort to violence, but the majority of Muslims would not resort to violence. But what is evident across the world, including in the UK, is that the majority of Muslims aren't, vocally at least, condemning violence in the name of blasphemy either. So if you're silent about it, it's unfortunate, but you will be lumped together as a monolithic group that endorses these ideas. So I think the very fact that the Muslim Council of Britain and other groups like that, and other groups that claim to represent Muslims, are using the term Islamophobia. For instance, Charlie Hebdo was universally lambasted as Islamophobic, but that's not a term you would use for the Communist Party of China, despite what it's doing to Uyghur Muslims, the re-education camps, so-called re-education camps over there. They're banning them from practicing Islamic rituals in Ramadan. They're banning the hijab, all of that. While they are never called Islamophobic, but some publication publishes a particular caricature. You have every right to be offended by those caricatures. It's right. We have every right to dislike those expressions of speech. But the very idea of freedom of speech, which parts of the world, including your part of the world, you fought hard to achieve those freedoms. The very concept of freedom of speech is to protect those ideas that are offensive. If there's no concept of, if it's a speech, if it's something that everybody endorses, that particular speech would not need any legal protection. So while, for instance, burning the Quran or caricatures of the Prophet are extremely repulsive, are offensive, and would inevitably spark backlash, but that's a reason to protect those expressions. And you look at what happened in Sweden. You look at what's happening in Denmark. These countries are now passing legislations endorsing exceptionalism on Islam. So why are you limiting? If it's a matter of blasphemy, why are you limiting yourself to Islam? For instance, eating beef is offensive to the Hindu minorities on your countries. Would you ban steakhouses in the UK? I don't see that happening in any time soon. So it's the idea that some minorities deserve to be protected, but others don't, makes no sense. And especially when the yardstick that you're using, why enact certain laws is because a particular community is going to react violently. So that is, you're basically saying that if you react violently enough, we are here to protect you. That makes absolutely no sense. So the term Islamophobia should not be used. Freedom of speech should be applicable on all religious ideologies. But the travesty over here is that these ideas should be led, especially when it comes to blasphemy against Islam. We need more Muslim voices in the world who would say that, yes, this offends me, but yes, this is also free speech. I don't see anybody anywhere in the world using these simple lines. So that is what is needed in the UK. More Muslim voices need to say that just because you dislike something does not give you the right to outlaw that. I think that's a discussion that need to be had.
Definitely. And I wanted to ask you specifically about some of these blasphemy laws that are cropping up in Europe in response to the Quran burnings. The various European governments seem to have this idea that if you outlaw blasphemy, then you will calm tensions, that you will prevent violence. But actually the opposite seems to be the case. If anything, isn't it encouraging, essentially radical Islamists to react violently, giving a kind of endorsement of their feelings of offence?
I think, like I just said, once you tell any particular community that we will accommodate you if you react violently, that's just simply giving them more motivation to continue to act more violently and demand more. If you're for right now you're offended by the burning of the holy book of Islam or mockery of the Prophet of Islam, you can go on, and there's no limit to what might offend you or I. We can be offended by anything. There's no, blasphemy is, as we say quite often, is a victimless crime. But that victimless crime is codified with death in other parts of the world. And to add to your statement about how this is actually encouraging more people, you're witnessing the same in for instance, the Muslim majority countries as well.
Yeah.
There are blasphemy laws, for instance, in Saudi Arabia and Iran. They're codified and they are enacted in the sense that in Saudi Arabia and Iran, and 8 to 10 other countries as well, these laws, if you are found guilty of blasphemy, you are likely to be sentenced to death, and that punishment will be carried out. But in other parts of the world, for instance, Pakistan has a blasphemy law as well. But Pakistan hasn't judicially executed anyone for blasphemy. Now, what that does is that actually encourages, because you already have the law or the idea is there, so it encourages the mobs to take the matter into their own hands because the idea is still there. Similarly, in Bangladesh does not even have a codified blasphemy law or death for blasphemy law. But there are, Islamists in Bangladesh are now demanding that we want, that the capital punishment for blasphemy. So the more you cede your space to anyone upholding Islamist values, the more space they would want. It's never going to be enough. Again, going back to the idea of Darul Harb and Darul Islam, the Islamist idea is until the entire world, embraces Islam, the struggle continues. So how much of your part of the world are you willing to give away?
Yeah, and do you think it's just a basic cowardice in the West for sort of failing to stand up for liberal values like free speech, and failing to stand up to the Islamist mob?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've written about this. I've said this, numerous spaces as well. That these are hard-earned rights. Humanity has, when we talk about Islam today, is not to say that other religions haven't had their periods of endorsing certain ideas that are similar. You in Europe, for instance, similar punishments for sacrilege or blasphemy were carried out, but that was like half a millennium ago or centuries ago. So today, when the world has moved on, what you overcame through enlightenment, through discourse, and through wars, it is hard. What the freedoms you have are hard earned, and again, this is when we argue that these freedoms should be universal. It's not. It's not the West or the Europe's prerogative, but what has happened is that in the West and in European countries, these freedoms are more prevalent than in other parts of the world. So when you try and argue that okay, this should be outlawed, but because it offends certain community or is against the will or the perceived imaginary well-being of that particular community, you're basically handing over the tools to the Islamists in the Muslim majority countries as well, because they would argue, look, it's a legislation in Europe that blasphemy against Islam is wrong. That means our stance for centuries and for decades in the nation state era has been vindicated by the West. So it's not just the harm that you're doing to your own countries. The harm is global.
And I want to talk a bit about Israel. I mean, in certainly in Europe, and there seems to be an unwitting support for, or perhaps a full-throated support sometimes for Hamas. And you wrote a really interesting piece about some of the protests in Gaza against Hamas. It's clear that, not all Palestinians are raging Islamists or anti-Semitic. And yet it seems as if some of the people in the West almost support the worst possible version of that cause, if that makes sense. What do you make of that distinction?
I think it's not just the Islamist narrative. It's also the if I may say so, it's also the leftist narrative historically. I mean, both the Islamist narrative and the leftist narrative, they have focused on the crimes of Israel more so than any other state. For instance, the military operations that Israel has conducted they have been scrutinized, especially from the leftists, I would say. They've been scrutinized more so than any other country. You give the example of Hamas. There are protests against Hamas taking place in Gaza. But even those protests by many quarters of those people who claim to be pro-Palestine, even those protests are being deemed as funded by Israel or artificially fabricated by Israel. Even though these protests, even before October 7, 2023, there were protests in Palestine. They have been protests in Gaza against Hamas in 2019. Even in the aftermath of the war in 2014, there was, because people have gradually, people in Gaza especially have gradually spoken up against Hamas because they have increasingly believed, and it's never been more evident than it's today, that the interests of Hamas are in complete contrast to the interests of Palestinians. But the narrative in the West, of course, your focus would be the West, but especially in the Muslim world, the narrative has been that to be pro-Palestine, you have to support Hamas. And especially in Muslim majority countries, it's not just the fact that they're supporting Hamas. Their antagonism against Israel has very little to do with Israel's military maneuvers, very little to do with the what is happening to Palestinians. The movement in especially Muslim majority countries is more anti-Israel, and it's not anti-Israel. It's anti-Semitic is the word that you would use. I would call it Judeo-phobic, because a lot of the Arabs are obviously Semites themselves. So the idea, the antagonism against the Jewish population is their focus. They're not worried about Palestinian rights. If they cared about the Muslim population, they'd be, there are more people killed in Syria over the past 15 years, multiple times more people than in Palestine. It's the same for Yemen since 2014. Even in Afghanistan, Pakistan, war on terror, multiple, over 100,000 people have been killed. They're Muslims, right? They're Muslims. So if this is the Islamist perspective, even if you want to focus on the Muslim victims. But from the West, there is a growing, that has been at least, a growing surge in academia and intelligentsia, where everything, especially from the left, has to be pinned as a crime that has been committed by the West. So Israel, by the fact that Israel is an ally of the Western powers, is an ally of the UK, you have to consider the narrative that opposes Israel. And unfortunately, the predominant narrative that opposes Israel is the Islamist narrative. The Islamist narrative was never in favor, of the two-state solution. The Islamist narrative has always been, and still is, maybe not in the UK as much, even though you do hear the cries of from the river to the sea, which is a claim that that the entirety of the region should be a singular Palestinian state. But especially in the Muslim majority countries, the idea that Jews are the enemies of Islam. Again, like we discussed earlier as well, these ideas are codified in Islamic scriptures. The idea that you can't befriend Jews and Christians is written in the Quran. Similarly, there are hadiths which say that the day of judgment would not come till the last Jews I'm paraphrasing, of course. Last Jew standing behind the tree and crying for help while the tree or the stone points out that there's a Jew behind me and you. These are all parts of scriptures that are considered not just holy, they're considered the ultimate, the final word that cannot be challenged or questioned. So these, and I don't see, my personal beef, so to speak, is with especially the Muslim progressives, because while the liberal left, who's not a part of the Muslim communities, would not understand the discourse that takes place within Muslim communities, the amount of Judeophobia that exists within the Muslim communities around the world. They might not be aware, but the progressive Muslims are fully aware that the anti-Israel sentiment in these communities, in these countries, has very little to do with settler colonialism or any post-colonial narrative. It's simply the aim or the ambition or the idea is the demolition of Jews. Last week there was a protest in Bangladesh, for instance. The protests were supposed to be pro-Gaza, pro-Palestine, and there were posters and placards of Hitler, and one particular placard said "Miss you, Hitler." Hitler was in Islamic. We need Hitler who's in Islamic here, something along those lines. So these ideas, it's someone who's and it's inevitable that these rallies in the Muslim majority countries will have Islamist war cries being chanted. But perhaps the travesty is that you have the same war cries being chanted in the West as well. For example, the Khyber Ya Yahud chant is prevalent in Western Europe and in other parts of the West. And that is that chant rekindles the Battle of Khyber, where the Muslim armies of the Prophet Muhammad they defeated the Jews, and that was preceded by the elimination of Banu Qurayza, the Jewish tribe. And for the Khyber, in Islamic theology or Islamic history, was what Endlosung, or the final solution was for Nazi Germany. That the Battle of Khyber eliminated Jews from that part of Arabia, and so they were either exiled or killed. So these chants are being invoked not just in Muslim majority countries; these are being invoked in the West as well. Now, critique. There needs to be critique for. I don't think you should sweepingly lump together, critique of Israel with being a with a pro-Hamas or pro-jihadist position. But it is the fault, I would say, first and foremost, of those protesters who have relegated any position in favor of Palestine as a position in favor of Hamas, as a position dedicated to the elimination of Israel. And just to give you another idea, global publications, especially with who have had a left-leaning tendency, they did not even cover, especially in our part of the world, did not even cover the fact that people in Gaza are protesting against Hamas, because it completely destroys their whole narrative that they've taken up, especially over the past year and a half, but even before that these are freedom fighters dedicated. They've been downplaying their jihad. They have been downplaying their assault on women. Even the events that have been documented by global organization, that these attacks, there is visual documentary evidence that sexual assaults, these crimes did take place. It's just complete dismissal of these crimes, while at the same time you want to focus. And if you want to focus on what Israel is doing, your voice would carry much more value, much more credibility if you were doing it when the perpetrators did not just happen to come from the only Jewish country in the world. Well, critique your own countries. So you're talking about human rights. You're talking about based on war crimes, while the countries, our own countries, are committing war crimes of a similar, or if not even worse degrees. So there is nothing pro-Palestinian about any of the narrative that is dominating the so-called pro-Palestinian spaces, especially even in the West. Definitely even more so in the Muslim world.
Kunwar, it's great to chat to you. Thank you very much.